The Gamesters of Triskelion. This episode was in Season 2 of Star Trek and premiered on January 5th, 1968, and it was the 16th episode of the season. It will be written by Margaret Arman and will be directed by Gene Nelson. It featured Joseph Ruskin as Galt and Angelique Pettyjohn as Shauna. Joseph Ruskin would say later in an interview that he was inspired by Russian folk dancers, in particular, a dance they performed called the Partisans, in which they wore long robes, similar to the one that Galt would wear in the episode. Ruskin recalls that it appeared like they were on wheels as they moved so fluently about. He practiced it, and it took him just about a week to master the movement. In an interesting side note, the three-armed symbol of Triskelion, as they appeared on Galt's robe, were counterclockwise, whereas the same symbol appeared in other places in the episode in a clockwise fashion. This was no doubt due to a breakdown in communication, as well as lack of time and resources to correct the error. The rough draft of the episode originally had Mr. Sulu with the landing party. However, George Takei would be in the process of working in a film titled The Green Berets at the start of the second season, and as a result, Mr. Chekhov would be written in to join the landing party on Triskelion, and it would be him that would be paired up with Tamun. Nichelle Nichols' character, Lieutenant Uhura, was also part of the landing party. Uhura's name in Swahili meant freedom, and Uhura is a citizen of the Bantu nation in the United Africa of the 23rd century. Being trained physically as a warrior, she was very capable of defending herself against the other thralls. The episode opens on stardate 3211.7. The Enterprise is establishing orbit around Gamma 2. This planetoid is an uninhabited automated communication and astrogation station. The reason the Enterprise was there was to establish a routine check of the facilities. Captain Kirk, Lieutenant Uhura, and Mr. Chekhov would be the landing party, and they headed for the transporter room, but once they were on the platforms, they would simply disappear. They vanished in a manner inconsistent with the transporter functions. Mr. Scott immediately informed Mr. Spock. Mr. Spock would order Mr. Scott to recheck the transporter, and he would scan for the landing party on the planet's surface. Meanwhile, the landing party would be thrown down onto the surface of a planet. Once Captain Kirk recognized a trinary solar system, as well as a different color in the sky, it was then that he realized that they were not on Gamma 2. Captain Kirk would then try to contact the Enterprise, however the communicator would not function. That is when 4 different individual life forms would encircle the landing party and attack them. Captain Kirk ordered the phasers to be used, but they were inoperative, so he ordered hand-to-hand combat. Captain Kirk, Lieutenant Uhura, and Mr. Chekhov would eventually be overtaken, and that is when they would first meet Galt. He identified himself as the master thrall of the planet Triskelion. He informed the landing party that he was pleased at their display of strength, and then they would make fine additions. They would later have collars placed around their neck, and these collars were the same color as the other thralls. However, the shields on either side were white. The others had solid colors in yellow, green, and red, but only Galt had each shield featuring all 3 colors. He would inform the landing party that they were ready to begin their training. Galt told Captain Kirk that the providers were expecting them and provided their transport to the planet. He would go on to say that Kirk, Chekhov, and Uhura's old titles meant nothing now. They were to become thralls themselves and spend the rest of their lives on Triskelion. Meanwhile, back on the Enterprise, Mr. Scott told Mr. Spock of a certain power surge that did not come from the Enterprise, nor the planet's surface. Even their atoms would have been scattered in space, and that would have been shown up in the scans, if that did occur. The Enterprise would continue to scan for the landing party. While back on Triskelion, Captain Kirk, Lieutenant Uhura, and Mr. Chekhov were shown their quarters. They would attempt to escape, but Galt would close his eyes and they would glow white. This would trigger the collars to light up and activate sensations of pain in the landing party, rendering them helpless. Galt would inform them that they were under the control of the collars of obedience, and that they would return to their quarters. and on the Enterprise, Mr. Spock would finish the scan and conclude that the landing party was not in the solar system at all. While back on Triskelion, Lieutenant Uhura would be introduced to the thrall Lars. He instructed her that he was to be her drill thrall. He was carrying a tray, and once inside her quarters, he began to assault her. Unable to see what was going on or able to offer assistance, Mr. Chekhov and Captain Kirk could only wait for Uhura to respond. She would fend off Lars, and he would tell her that it was not allowed to refuse selection. Captain Kirk would be introduced to his drill thrall named Shauna. She brought him food and water and informed him that it was time for nourishment interval. On the Enterprise, Ensign Haynes would report to Mr. Spock that she noticed a fluctuating energy reading on a hydrogen cloud. It's faint, but it consistently reads in excess of predictable energy levels. Mr. Spock would investigate and deduce that it was an ion trail. Mr. Spock would instruct Ensign Hayes to plot a follow course. The course heading would be 310 Mark 241, and they would proceed at warp factor 2. While back on Triskelion, Mr. Chekhov would introduce himself to his drill thrall. His drill thrall would be named Tamoon. She informed him that if the providers would permit it, that perhaps they could be selected. Captain Kirk's drill thrall, Shauna, told him that the collars they wear can be a sign of our providers. By the color of the light, it can be known who holds them. She goes on to say that whichever provider provides the most quatlus for a thrall has the mark to make them their own. Captain Kirk informs her that that is called slavery where he comes from. Shauna told him that she who bore her was killed in a freestyle match, and that he would learn everything he needed to know. A flashing red light would later indicate a drill interval. On the Enterprise, Mr. Spock traced the ion trail to a system called N24 Alpha, 11.630 light-years away. They would continue to follow the ion trail as it was the only logical option available to them. While on Triskelion, the drill was interrupted by Galt, who had a thrall that was to be punished for being too slow to respond to a command, and that he was to be used as the practice target. He was tied up, and Galt instructed Lieutenant Uhura to attack him. She refused to do so. Galt would then order Lieutenant Uhura to be disciplined by Thru, the largest thrall. When Lars went to tie her, Captain Kirk intervened and took responsibility, and as a result, he was made to take the discipline by Galt. After being whipped as the practice thrall, Galt would intercede and instruct that it was time for rest interval, which consisted of 15 trisenks. After resuming, Captain Kirk would be able to get his hands back in front of him. He would later use the rope he was tied up with to choke out Thru. Provider 1 would then call a halt. Provider 1 would then bet 300 quatlus for the newcomer. The bid would increase and ultimately land at 2,000 quatlus, but the newcomers would ultimately be vended to Provider 1. They would later bet 5,000 quatlus that the newcomers would be untrainable and have to be destroyed. The Provider instructed Galt to mock them. Galt would then close his eyes and they would flash. In an instant, the collars had been white on Captain Kirk, Mr. Chekhov, and Lieutenant Uhura were now red, the color of Provider 1. Galt told them that since they were full-fledged thralls, any disobedience would be punishable by death. Later, Captain Kirk would be running with his drill thrall, Shauna. He would ask to rest, and they would stop in what appeared to be ruins. He told her about love on Earth and the freedom people enjoyed there. He asked her about the providers, and when she attempted to tell him about them, her collar lit up, and she was punished. Captain Kirk asked that he be punished because he was the one that made her talk. Galt would later appear and inform them that since Captain Kirk amused the providers, there would be no punishment, and that they must return to their quarters. Later, when Shauna brought nourishment to Captain Kirk, he would kiss her and then proceed to knock her out. He gently put her down on a bench, apologized, and took the key to the cell door. He then freed Mr. Chekhov and Lieutenant Uhura. They made their way back to the training area, where Galt would appear and activate the collars of obedience. The Enterprise would achieve orbit around Triskelion, and the scanners would indicate a small gathering of life forms in the southern hemisphere of the planet. Mr. Spock would inform Dr. McCoy that he would beam down alone. However, Dr. McCoy asked to go with him, and Mr. Spock granted his request. He would be stopped before getting to the bridge, as Provider 1 would tell him that he nor Dr. McCoy could beam down. While on the planet's surface, Captain Kirk would hear the verbal communication between his bridge crew and the Providers. He would welcome them to Triskelion and inform them of the Providers in their role on the planet. Kirk would demand that the Providers show themselves. He is told that as long as he wears the collar, he is no threat, and that they approved his request. He is transported down 1,000 meters below the planet's surface. He would notice a vast power source behind him, shielded by rock. The Providers told him that they once had humanoid forms, but they would evolve through eons of dedicating themselves to intellectual pursuits. They go on to say that they would become the physically simple and mentally superior beings which appeared before him. Being that the Providers enjoyed gambling, Captain Kirk would offer them an opportunity. He would later wager the lives of himself and his crew. They would all become thralls and would offer generations of entertainment for the Providers. In exchange, he would wager for the freedom of himself as well as all the thralls. Ultimately, the Providers would accept the wager and inform him that the game would be 3 thralls against him alone. Once back at the drill site, Captain Kirk is told that he had the yellow sections of the floor. The thralls must stay on the blue sections, and failure to stay on their own color would result in a loss of a weapon. He is also told that in order to eliminate an opponent, they must be killed. If they are only injured, they will be replaced by a fresh thrall. Due to the stakes of the wager, the Enterprise bridge crew was able to watch the game. The first thrall that was eliminated was the one with the whip. Captain Kirk would throw the broken half of the spear and would strike him in the abdomen, impaling him. The second thrall would be eliminated as the Andorian would throw a spear at Captain Kirk, but Captain Kirk would duck, and it would simply impale the thrall with the net, which was Lars. Later, the Andorian would be replaced by Galt with Shauna. She said that Captain Kirk had lied about everything he had said to her, and a struggle would ensue, and they would fight. She would fight him, however, he would overpower her and threaten to kill her. And upon the thralls, she would surrender in the name of the thralls. The Providers would honor the wager and release all of the thralls. Captain Kirk would tell Shauna that he did not lie to her, and he ripped off his collar passionately. After Captain Kirk would leave on the USS Enterprise, she would look up at the sky and say that one day she would too go to the flicker of lights in the sky and join him.